So now let's continue with our database abstract class. But before we write any further methods, let's go back to our test unit database and create a new test. This time we're going to call it database test. There we go. And what I'm going to do is this one will also extend test case. There we go. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a private property called DB. And what this property will represent is basically the database instance. And let's import it here as well. There we go. So basically this DB property will represent the database object. The first test that we are going to write is going to be called, it obviously needs to be a public function, creates new PDO instance and executes simple query. So basically what we're going to do is create a new instance using the database manager. So let's quickly do this. This DB equals database manager, and we want to use the make method, and that's all we need to do here basically, because database manager takes care of generating the appropriate database object, whether it's SQLite in our case or MySQL. Obviously in our case is going to be SQLite, because again, if we go back to PHP unit, that's what we've specified here. Basically for the DB connection, we want SQLite, so we should have SQLite associated with this DB property here. So next, now that I've got this database instance here, what I want to do with this database instance, so this DB instance, is to execute the following statements. For instance, select max 1, 10. So this should return the maximum number out of this range basically. So it's going to be between 1 and 10, and obviously 10 is going to be the maximum. So this statement should return 10. And I'm going to associate it with the variable called result equals. And now what I'm going to do is to use the assertion. So this assert equals 10 and the result. And again, what I'm going to do is provide the third argument for this method. If we just put on separate lines, and the message, if it fails, is going to say query returned incorrect max value. Okay, now obviously our database object does not have execute method yet. So what I'm going to do basically, before we actually run any tests, let's indicate that it is a test by adding this doc block here as well. So test, there we go. And now if we go back to the terminal, run PHP unit, there we go. And obviously we have an error here, which tells us that call to undefined method execute on SQLite. As you can see, it tells us that this DB property is actually representing SQLite driver. So let's go back to our editor, and what we are going to do now is basically create this execute method. So database PHP, and after our construct options, before we actually create this execute method, what I'm going to do is create another method called set attribute. It's going to be a public function, set attribute, and it's simply going to take two arguments. First one is the attribute, and the other one is going to be a value. And what it will do is basically delegate the call to the same method, the method with the same name on our PDO object. So set attribute, an attribute and value, and there we go. So it's basically whenever we're gonna use say our database instance, we can use the set attribute to set any attributes on the PDO object. Let's just create a doc block for this method as well. And what we are going to type in here is basically delegate method call to underlying PDO object instance method. Now let's put it like this. Okay, so this is just like a simple helper method basically to be able to access this set attribute on the PDO objects. Okay, so our execute method now. So we're going to start with the public again, because we need to be able to access it from outside of this object. and the method call name is execute, and it will take 4 arguments. So let's basically go there to brackets, and we're going to put them on separate lines as well. First one is going to be our SQL statement. Second one will be array of parameters that we want to pass to our together with the statement, basically, because we're going to be using the prepared statement to make sure that obviously we are safe for any sort of SQL injection, against any SQL injection. And then we have third argument is also an array, and it's going to be a driver underscore options in case we need to pass any, and then return true, whether we want to basically return the result, or we'd like to return the statement and chain it later on. So the first thing we're going to do is create a variable called statement, and this statement will be simply this statement, and we pass SQL and driver options to it. Now we obviously haven't got this statement method, so let's quickly create it as well. So add method, and this statement method will be a private one because we're only going to be accessing it from within this this object, this class. Okay, and this one takes obviously 2 arguments. Now our second one, let's type hint it with array, and by default it may be an empty array, so it's not the required argument. Okay, and then we go for statement equals, and let's go for this PDO object, and we're going to run the prepare method on it, passing our SQL statement and driver options if there are any. So we're preparing our statement for execution, and then when we check in, if exclamation mark, checking if statement evaluates to boolean false because of this exclamation mark, then we want to throw new PDO exception, and this PDO exception will say query statement failed. Okay, just make sure that obviously this PDO exception is also imported right at the top. Okay, so basically what we're going to do after all this, simply return the statement. So what this method does, we could pretty much put this call directly here and associate it with the statement, but then we would have to do manually this check if it evaluates to false, basically, and then throw the exception. So rather than doing this every time we're going to be using the statement, so actually the prepare method on the PDO object, we just have the statement method which does all this. It basically executing the prepare method and then checks if it evaluates to true or false. If it evaluates to false, it will throw the exception. So we've got everything. We basically separate this concern into a separate, basically putting this into a separate method. And now we know that this statement method definitely did not evaluate to false, because otherwise obviously this PDO exception would be thrown. And in fact, it will return the PDO statement object instance. Okay, so the next thing, so that's basically everything within this statement method. Now we can use this statement within our execute method to call the execute method on it. So what I'm going to actually do, rather than just call it directly on the statement, I'm going to associate the result, which will be of a Boolean true or false, with the result variable. So result statement, and now execute, and we are passing through our parameters. So basically, statement runs the prepare method, so we're passing the SQL with any sort of placeholders and driver options if there are any, and then we're passing parameters separately to make sure that obviously we are doing this in 2 separate ways. So basically binding is separate from the statement itself, obviously to ensure that we are basically okay for any SQL injection. Okay, so now result stores Boolean true or false. Now this return 4th argument comes into play. Now if you want to return straight away true or false after this execute, then you can do it. So we're going to check if return, sorry, not result, return, then we simply return result. So we will know whether it was executed successfully or it failed. Otherwise, we simply return statements. So we can either, we can basically chain further methods on it. So if there's anything else we want to execute on this statement instance, we can, basically, if it was set to false. Okay, so that's our execute method. Let's now add doc blocks as well to it. Execute end statement, two new methods. So for the execute, what we are going to do is simply say execute SQL statement. And for the statement, prepare SQL statement. Let's go like this. That's fine. We can obviously, this is, we can import this PDO statement because this statement is basically representing the PDO statement object instance. So we can import it as well, and the same, not here is okay because it's either Boolean. If we decided to return it straight away, it's going to return Boolean true or false after executing this execute method on the statement. Otherwise, it will return PDO statement, basically. Okay, so our execute method is now ready. Let's go back to our terminal and try to run the command again. So PHP unit, and let's see if we are passing, and we do. So we've got two tests, two assertions. We can now safely use this execute method to run any queries basically directly on this database object instance.